Welcome to Digital Currents, brought to you by Morgan Creek Digital. I'm Xavier Segura. Each episode, we spotlight the topics and people changing the tech industry with a focus on AI, blockchain, chips, and big data. Thanks for listening, and please make sure to subscribe if you like what you hear. And remember, stay current. Mark, happy Friday. We made it. I like our color combo today.
Well, and I actually almost wore the orange top, but I did go with the orange bottom today. So I've got the Bitcoin orange pants, and I have the Bitcoin chill, Chilly Willy on the beach. We're headed to the beach this weekend to open it up for the year, and Bitcoin is on a roll here. And, last week I wore the green, thinking we get a big green candle. We didn't get a big green candle. I mean, we're up 4% this week. But here's an interesting thing. If I asked people, when did Bitcoin make the low? I don't think people would say it. And it's interesting, we talked about this a couple times, that right before tax day, there's usually a low in the U.S. because people sell to pay their taxes. And particularly in a year where you had a big up year the previous year, which we did, up 200+%. So April 9th was the low. And just, not to put you on the spot, but how much do you think we're up from the low?
From low? Okay, so on April 9th, I kind of remember this, Mark, because we were discussing it in IC, and then I always have this FOMO when I say, okay, now let me do my own DCA, and then I try to time it as an individual. So I know we were like close to 75-ish, 74, and then we jumped up, we were at the 94 plateau for a little bit. We broke out to 95, 96, so that's 20 grand right there. So that's like 30%, right?
Yep, just under. So, that's a big move.
Huge.
Think about it. That's a big move. And I'll argue that the real move hasn't even started because money supply growth globally has exploded.
Right.
Money supply growth in the U.S. still hasn't quite released because Powell says he's not going to lower interest rates, but he kind of has increased liquidity a little bit. They stopped contracting the balance sheet. They haven't bought any bonds yet, but I think that's coming. So at the end of the day, I think we're on track for a very interesting fall. I think summer will be kind of like this, and maybe we hover here around 100 for a while. But anyway, very exciting stuff. And what's interesting? Bitcoin dominance just hit a new all-time high. And that's and we talked about this last week. You had a great analysis about ETH. Part of it is ETH and it kind of fallen out of favor. Now, it's interesting. I asked the AI agents this morning, trying to replace our great analyst who does this for us, right? He gives
AI overlord. Yeah.
And so I asked the AIs, what the big stories were. It actually said the number one story for blockchain was this upcoming Petra upgrade in Ethereum, which I don't know all the details, but maybe Ethereum is going to go down swinging, so to speak. But Solana also announcing some big upgrade now. I love the Solana upgrade. We're fixing the problems again. Yeah, we know we were down, and we know we can't settle all the transactions when the system gets clogged, but we're fixing it again. And so,
but there's nothing wrong with our blockchain, but we're fixing it just in case.
Yeah. It's like that water leak you had. Fixing it again. It's like quitting smoking again, right? If it's again, then you didn't the first time, no matter what.
Right. And to your
I'll go on a diet this year.
Right, right. And to your point about kind of how some of these alts, and including BTC for that matter, have moved up pretty dramatically in inside of a month's time. I mean, Solana was another one that moved up like 50%, right? Because it's bottoming out at 100. And what we tend to be seeing right now, Mark, in this market is that you are getting to the point of we always talk about the double peaks, but we rarely talk about the double bottoms,
Yep.
right? And I think that's one of those things where even I was falling prey to this on my own side where nobody wants to catch a falling knife, but we all are so helpless in realizing that we don't want to avoid, the ride up the escalator, right?
Yeah, but it's funny. And we talk about this differently than how we live it.
Yeah,
Kind of interesting.
of
So
course.
here we are talking about short-term stuff, but in our day job, we buy it over time. When the new money comes in, we make an allocation, and people say, but what do I need you to buy Bitcoin? Like, well, you don't, but our discipline to do it is a value. But the real thing is beyond Bitcoin, where we add the most value is getting access to these other coins at discounts, right? We buy from the foundations at a discount, or we buy, from other people who are willing to part with illiquid shares or soon to be liquid shares, pre-token generation event. So there is some value in just having us accumulate on your behalf. But it's like anything else. If you don't have the discipline, you won't get the outcome you desire. So it is just, in this case, all about the discipline.
Yeah. And so, Mark, we're not a political show, but we are influenced by politics, like all folks that are in the digital assets realm. So let's talk about the first 100 days of crypto. Like what we did there. So the first 100 days of crypto, lots have happened, Mark, lots of happenings. So we've climbed to 95,000 to the recap, which we spoke about. The ETFs come surging back, right? Deal making is having this banner year right now. And we also had, some pretty key developments from President Trump, with kind of this vibe shift that's happening on the pro crypto side. And then, of course, our friends over at Strategy, they just stacked, a casual 15,000 BTC.
Incredible. Incredible.
Yeah, incredible stuff. And so, as we kind of look middle of the week here, we saw a couple of movements. ETH was bottoming out. It's starting to come a little bit more. But if we zoom out and kind of the point that you got me on last week, which I'm really glad you made this, because I was falling victim to this thinking that had dominated over the past couple of quarters when we're bottoming out. That is BTC like a tech stock. And you say, well, Alex, I'll disagree slightly, but the numbers are strongly in your favor, Mark. And so when we look at just what happened in the month of April, at the beginning of the month, NASDAQ, they lost, 1.48%, dollar declined 4%, and gold gained 6.1, which is, in my opinion, a net move for Bitcoin. But BTC, as you all well know, was up 12%.
Yeah.
And now the analysts are coming back around and advocates about it continuing to be this alternative hedge amongst, this growing trend. And so this point that I mentioned about this kind of blockbuster crypto deal making, we had some pretty big movements. We had 88 deals so far this year, 8.2 billion in value. And we started seeing, other ideas,
Well, hold on. Time out.
let's flag on the field.
Time out, right? Because, hold on, X. Everyone, like in the media and this is a little dated, but, the hate, and look, I'm trying to do my guitar, and
Oh, yeah.
my granddaughter likes Taylor Swift, so I'm trying to learn how to play Shake It Off, right? So I've got haters gonna hate going through my brain, literally. And the haters are gonna hate. The haters are gonna say, this is not an asset class. This is not real assets. This is a total scam. $8 billion of deals with a B. And you say, but that's tiny. I'm like, stop. $8 billion of real companies where other companies want to acquire them. And the one that it isn't going to happen. Well, I don't think it's going to happen. I hope it doesn't happen. The one that just got announced this week is XRP made an offer for Circle, stablecoin company,
Wow.
for $5 billion. Although one company, and Jeremy politely said, "Go away," to Brad, and so Brad this morning said, "All right, tough guy, 20. He went from 5 to 20. Now,
Wow.
of course, I'm sure that's not cash, right? That's Brad spending this imaginary. Well, I say it's imaginary. The XRP army will be mad at me, but I, I'm well. I don't believe Circle's going to do it. I think absolutely no way, because I'm sure that's not a cash offer. But it just goes to show you that whether it's 8, whether it's 5, or whether it's 20, those are real numbers, real companies. And when I was going through the stories of the week,
Mm-hmm.
everywhere you look, whether it's data, chips, AI, or blockchain, it's all interconnected.
That's right.
All of this stuff in MasterCard this week announced a multi-billion, they didn't put a number on it, but a multi-billion-dollar effort to integrate crypto rails, digital rails, into their payment network. Now, it was a little vague on details, but that's an acknowledgement that, look, this stuff is coming. And we can stay on our COBOL system, run it on a mainframe, and try to stop, the wall coming, or we can just embrace it. And
Right.
it's a big deal. Big
And
deal.
to the point, Mark, I mean, we always, we kicked off, we had relationship now dating back years, but kind of the formal inauguration was in 21. And man, was that a peak year. And so when we kind of look at where we are in relation to that and trying to get back, if not past what were laid there as far as the groundwork, if you look at some of the activity, Mark, which I'm sure you have, in 21, those crypto deals and transactional value were something like 17-ish billion. So at 8, we're basically now at that run rate, if not exceeding that. But as you look a little bit deeper, the kinds of deals are starting to shift. To your point, there's this interconnectedness, but there's also this financial upscale that we've been describing here. So things like crypto native companies moving into prime brokerage services, like with Xtrust, or now, with some others that have been acquiring very big companies. Like, for example, Ripple acquired prime broker Hidden Road for over $1 billion. And their bet is that institutional investors are going to step up their exposure to crypto. And so when we speak about this idea that crypto is going to disintermediate and kind of uproot the financial services industry, we were thinking about it in a DeFi context. I myself was not thinking that these companies, or even when we spoke about Coinbase, were effectively going to become these new neobanks, which is
Well, that's a huge story. And look, we got a hint of it when MicroStrategy changed their name to Strategy B, right? The Bitcoin B. Everyone's like, oh, it's just an acknowledgement of Bitcoin. I'm like, that's a leading indicator because they're going to add ANK. And so we got that confirmation. I will say it's a confirmation that that's coming when Coinbase said they're going to apply for a banking license. And, it's really funny. We invested in a number of these companies that, unfortunately didn't survive the, meaning the digital asset lenders. They got taken down by the big banks, right?
They were ahead of their time, Mark.
But the big thing is you couldn't call them banks. They were basically taking deposits, lending those deposits, paying interest. That's kind of what a bank does. But the banks were like, no, you can't call them banks because they don't have charters and they don't have licenses and, fine, digital financial services companies. And, the same way JP Morgan became the banks, right? He became the most dominant bank. And there's really big four today. I think we're going to see this reemergence of, we're to call them neobanks or whether they're the banks of the future. I think this is big. And Coinbase is for sure going to be one of them.
Oh, yeah.
Strategy Bank, I think I'll call it what it is. I think they're going to call themselves Strategy Bank. I think that's probably going to be one. And then there'll be a couple others, and Kraken is trying to break in there. Gemini is making some big moves. I think Gemini could emerge. What's really interesting on this point? So Strategy, best performing stock in the U.S., and it's not close, right? It's whooped
for years.
The Mag 7, and I mean there's most small cap stocks that have done, but as far as big companies, it's crushing all the other tech.
Yeah.
Japan, number one performing stock, Metaplanet.
We like them. Yep.
Europe, number one performing stock in 6 months now, but it's only been around for a while, is the blockchain group.
Oh,
now, this is a little teeny tiny micro cap, so it's the law of small numbers. But taking the same strategy, taking the same playbook, they even show it on this slide. It's like, okay, here's strategy, here's Metaplanet, here's us. And we're going to do the same thing. And now there's 130 or 140 companies doing the Bitcoin playbook. We talked about Upexi that's doing it in Solana. There's a couple other Solana businesses. Others are probably going to try this with other assets. Look, if you can own any asset and issue stock above the NAV of the underlying assets, whether you're gold miner, platinum miner, corn seller, whatever tech company. I mean, take Apple. Apple gets to issue new stock at prices way above their NAV, I mean the value of their goods and services. And the crazier part is they haven't grown revenue in over 3 years. I mean, the revenue's dead flat for 3 years, and yet they still sell at a growth multiple. So anytime they can issue new stock or bonds, it's accretive for shareholders.
Not bad for a fruit company, right? To quote Forrest Gump, it's like, and then I invested in a fruit company and we didn't have to worry about money anymore. He's like one less thing that he worried about. But to kind of pick up some of the points that you mentioned, Mark, which were really good ones. This idea from looking at kind of how 25 is mirroring 21, and there's these 4-year cycles in investments, and we're kind of starting to see this now. There is this rush for public legitimacy in our markets, as opposed to a digital rush, gold rush that we saw in 21, where companies were trying to exit smartly because there was going to be a lid put on this jar of IPO activity. But we've seen now 21 Capital, a new Bitcoin company planning to go public through a 3.6 merger with what? Is that a SPAC that I hear? Those were dead, I thought, Mark. But
SPAC, it's worth dead. And I mean, this is an amazing story.
Yeah.
One, portfolio company of ours, Strike, Jack Mahler's, famous Jack. He's the guy that, orange pilled Bukele down in El Salvador. And Jack's a kid. And I mean that in a loving way. I mean, he started stuff in his late teens and young 20s, and I'm not even sure he's 30 yet. He might be. But he's building something, and he got tapped by Cantor. So Lutnick, right, our Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, not Treasury, Commerce. He wanted to be Treasurer, but they gave him Commerce. Leaves, gives his son the CEO title of Cantor. Cantor's one of the biggest fixed income brokerages and, famous for 9/11, top floors of, World Trade Center. God rest all their souls.
Right.
I mean, terrible tragedy for Cantor that day. But they survived, and they have thrived, and they've given back to the community and done lots of great stuff. And so really inspirational story. And so the son now, and so they bought into Tether. hey, look, there's Tether truthers out there, and there are people that hate Tether and FTX and all. Fine, whatever. But Tether is one of the largest liquidity providers in the digital asset markets around the world. So many people outside the U.S. use Tether as a payment rail. Mm-hmm. One of those profitable companies in the world in terms of particularly profit per employee. I mean, I think they have sub 100 employees and they make, tens of billions of dollars in profit. I mean, insanely profitable. And so Lutnick buys in to Tether. Now Tether is going to contribute 42,000. Well, I don't know if it's all Tethers or SoftBank's coming in here too. And I think SoftBank has some Bitcoin that they're contributing. So SoftBank and Tether are contributing 42,000 Bitcoin. It's always 420 something, but 42,000 Bitcoin. And they tap Jack to be the CEO. And I think we talked about this. Must be something about the name Jack, right? You can be CEO of multiple companies.
That's right. That's right.
So I guess that
Jack Ma, Jack Dorsey. I mean, the list just goes on and on.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, so I guess I better get up on my son Jack to go get a couple CEO jobs.
Mark, to your point, like, is there a window now? And obviously we've seen it. We're trying to advise our companies to keep their eyes open with the macro. But then our other friend Novogratz, right? They're looking at, and it feels like the path is now clear for their group, Galaxy Digital, to begin trading on NASDAQ as soon as May 16th, pending some shareholder approval. And I think this will be interesting because NASDAQ is like where the big boys play, right? Especially on the tech side. Meta.
Well, and to that point, so, Mike would have been happy to go public in the U.S. when he first got started, and they're like, "No, you're a crypto bro. You can't go public in the U.S. We don't accept that." So he did what any enterprising, financial services guy would do. He said, "I'll just merge into another company somewhere else." And so he merged into this, Toronto listed company, Galaxy. I'm sorry, and turned into Galaxy TO, and uplisting into the U.S. It's not super easy, but it can be done. And now that Operation Choke Point's been totally reversed, and that back to the 100 days. Okay, Trump promised a bunch of stuff. He did many of the things. He released Ross and he did a handful of the other things that he said he was going to do. Now he didn't establish the SBR. He tried to issue an executive order, but he had to call it a digital asset stockpile, which is just a fancy term for the stuff we already have. We won't sell. But he didn't have the authority. She's kind of the way. Talk first, ask questions later. He promised, but then is like, oh, I can't do that by executive order. So need Congress. And for whatever reason, Congress didn't get it done. I thought they would. I thought Lummis would get it done, but there's still resistance from Warren and others.
But we saw more movement in the states, to your point, Mark. And I think that was the beauty of this states versus national agenda, where we saw this reversion, of course, right? Where we saw that it was really hard on the federal side to, have any sort of pro crypto legislation in 21. And then, different states had little pockets. And then now we had this reversion where on the federal side, there was a lot of fervor for that. And then some of the states were a little bit more reluctant, although they had their bills lined up. And then we had Texas come through in a positive way. But the point about the pause, we had at some point to this idea of, the pro-crypto policy, there was going to be an inner circle, so to speak, of American-based companies that were going to be the beneficiaries of let's say the not so invisible hand, the quite visible hand, right?
Yeah.
Kind of coin a phrase. But now the SEC has punted the decisions on XRP and Doge ETFs, which, the XRP army is probably now, I love Gladiator, and I do as well. In Gladiator 2, I was excited for this because you had to actually see the showdown. Like, what could Maximus do if he was able to get out of Rome and have his troops there?
Right.
And then, we saw what happened in the second one. I want to spoil it for everybody, but the army was ready to go. And so now the XRP army is ready at the doorsteps of Rome, which is Capitol Hill, but they're told to wait, Mark. And we thought that...
Yeah, waiting is armies aren't good at waiting.
No.
They get impatient. And it is interesting, DC is the new Rome, right?
Yes.
I mean, if you go to DC, the architecture is kind of like Rome. It kind of feels like Rome. And, Elon went in there and tried to bust up the monopolies, and he did a little bit. It's interesting, though, that despite all the headlines of all the savings, the deficit set a new record. So I think it goes to just how entrenched governments, Roman government, empires are tough to topple. But once they start going, you can't save them. So I do think about what that means globally. And again, in what we do, well, okay, I'll stop rambling, but this is really funny. So ask the chatbots, what are the top stories?
Mm-hmm.
First thing it gave me, Meta, Grok. I'm like, every story was U.S. I'm like, okay, stop. I don't want just U.S. tech. This is a global industry. Give me the top global stories.
Absolutely.
Like, oh, if that's what you want, well, then clearly DeepSeek is a big deal and Quen's a big deal.
Yeah.
And there's this little thing that just happened with Huawei, in that they just, actually two big things. One, they released a chip that is competitive with the Blackwell.
That's right.
Like, and they're delivering them directly to Chinese people who are prohibited from buying the Blackwell chip. So the sanctions aren't going to work. It's like, well, so that's the first one. But the second one, this one's even bigger. I don't want to be, overly, well, yes, I do. I mean, I am, a hyperbolic personality. This is big. Huawei just made a 5 nanometer chip without EUV. Mm. And that's a big deal because ASML is a monopoly. So if you want to make semiconductors, you got to buy these machines and use this UV light to mask the chipset. Well, if you don't need that anymore, that's a really big deal. And then another one came up that's equally big, and it's a little bit, it's funny. Taiwan thinks they're Taiwan, right? Independent nation. China thinks it's part of China. And that's always been a little bone of contention. I laugh because people say, U.S. is worried because, China's going to invade Taiwan. I'm like, no, they're not. They think it's part of China. Why would they invade themselves? But TSMC just completed a new production run at 2 nanometers.
Wow.
And it doesn't sound like that much to go from 3 nanometers to 2 nanometers, other than it's so small it's hard to imagine. But it actually is a massive increase, both in terms of productive power, but more importantly, energy efficiency. Mm-hmm. So with all of this, I saw a chart, and we'll have a different chart of the day, but I saw this great chart. And, it's total chart crime. And part of the problem with most charts is they just linear extrapolate whatever trend is going on. And so it basically said, based on current energy usage, AI is going to use up 85% of all the Earth's energy. Like, well, where have I heard that before? Well, I heard that with computers. I heard that with, gasoline engines. If they kept it the same, miles per gallon, they're going to use up all the oil in the world, and we run out of oil. They haven't run out of oil. And, innovation, we get more miles to the gallon, and we have alternative fuels. So same thing's true here, is the idea that chips aren't going to get less energy dependent. is comical. And so here's a massive improvement in energy coming out of TSMC. So I know we live in America and we read the American press and it's so America-centric, but I'll tell you what, the innovations outside the U.S. are mind-boggling.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, Mark, because I think that's definitely an ethos that we espouse here at the Creek, where, we're not just looking for a particular region. We're trying to find, the chain to rule all chains, right? So wherever that advantage is, we'll try and look for it. And as we do that, it informs us about our own market, right?
Yeah.
So, how much did investing in LATAM and understanding how some of the early markets actually are outpacing digital adoption in things like financial services, both for, younger populations, but then also, aging populations that are interconnected across various countries. And, what that means for incorporating AI into the intake process or into potentially now other geos that look like LATAM, for example, parts of the Middle East, where they're helping farmers out, with things like getting loans. And so when we think about, how that makes up a portfolio, we've generally been around 30% international, which has helped us in some of those down markets in the US where valuations were not just kind of getting out of control. The companies themselves started to not be as strong as what we were seeing internationally. And then eventually what started happening was things started swinging back towards the middle, where we started seeing more competition in the US, where improvements started to happen. And we started to see these chip designing companies, which we became very fond of in the last couple of months. And as we kind of think about this new, I guess, dichotomy here, Mark, and I'm glad you picked up the Huawei story, because that's a perfect example of what we were describing in chip wars, where if you have this gate to say, okay, you can't get, the keys to, the fastest car anymore. It's like, okay, I'm going to make the most fuel efficient car and I'm going to stay in the road longer. So I'm going to get
that. And that's exactly the point, right? I mean, necessity is the mother of invention.
All right.
And, Ronald Reagan had this great quote about tariffs. And, the thing about this whole tariff war thing that's so silly, right, is we actually have a lot of data on tariffs. We have 249 years of data, to be precise, in the U.S., all of it negative. We've tried twice in the past these big moves in tariffs, 1823, 1930. Both ended up in depressions. Like the 1840 depression was worse than the 1940s depression, but no one talks about it. And it's always 100 years later that people try the same stupid idea, because it takes 3 generations. Everyone has to be dead, so no one remembers how bad it was. And so here we are trying, and Reagan had this quote about, when people talked about tariffs in the 80s, he's like, well, who wants tariffs? Unproductive, non-competitive companies and industries who want to protect their workers. So let's say, in the 80s, it was the automotive companies that didn't want those Japanese cars to come into the U.S. Well, why? Well, because the auto union workers didn't want them. Well, why? Why don't you just get more productive? Well, we can't compete with Japan. Like, sure you can. I mean, now it takes time and it takes innovation and it takes good leadership. But at the end of the day, what happens is if you block the industry, what you end up with is less competitive industries being preserved, but you stifle innovation, and therefore you end up long-term losing lots of jobs that don't ever get created by the new innovation and new competitive companies. So instead of, U.S. companies innovating and then sending their cars to China, which is what, Europe did for a while, we lost out on that. And so you see the jobs that you save, but you don't see the millions more jobs that you lose. And that's why tariffs are always bad. And that's why comparative advantage is always good. And the invisible hand of free markets is always better. But it's not politically expedient.
All right. So I'll hit you, Mark. I haven't hit you with the random numbers in a while. So what do you think? What do you think this number is related to? It is in the Bitcoin space, and it is said by somebody who is quite well known in the Bitcoin space. 2.4 million.
2.4 million.
What could that represent?
Wow, 2.4 million. It's too small to be the number of Bitcoin holders. It's way too small to be hash rate. I would say companies that do transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain. I don't know.
No, yeah, it's almost an impossible question, which is why I had to ask it, because the answer to impossible questions are always better than the real answer. But in this case, you'll like the answer. So this is what Kathy said. And the reason probably, Mark, that we were trying to find some ground here is because previously, this is the price prediction for one Bitcoin. Previously, Kathy said 1.5. The knock on her was, well, when is this actually going to happen?
Right.
But ARK Invest actually said 2030 was the price target. And they raised the stakes from 1.5 to 2.4. So, extremely bullish on this, digital gold narrative. But as we know,
well, and that is super bold. And I probably should remember it, because now that you say it, I do remember that graph. Look, a little bit of chart crime there, a little bit of linear extrapolation, but they have sound reasoning why. But here's the interesting stat, and there's a lot of math behind this, but it is interesting. So, the first halving, we went from 10 to 100, so 10-fold increase, and then the next halving went to 1,000. Then we went to 10,000. This current halving, arguably, we went to 100,000, and we're not quite 100,000, but we're almost there. Well, the next halving, which would be in 28, would be 1 million. Now, when you say that out loud, people are like, no, that could never happen. Well, no, it could. One Bitcoin is still one Bitcoin. What's changing is the dollars that we're pricing, or the yen or the euros, and the likelihood that we're not going to print more money between now and 4 years from now, pretty low, particularly if we, continue down this bad path on tariffs and don't just say, oh, it was all a joke, which I think is coming. But this growth to 1 million, so it's not that far to go from 1 million to 2.4.
The range is, 500,000 up to 2.4. But, those are large numbers. But if you look at it from a growth perspective, you're dealing with either a 32% CAGR for the low end to a 53% CAGR, which, seems quite, to me, seems more reasonable, given what you're seeing on the institutional adoption and kind of what has kept pace over the last couple of years.
Oh, look, if we get the both institutional / corporate / endowment foundation FOMO coupled with nation state FOMO, I mean, that number actually might even be conservative. And again, people said, that's based on what? I'm like, it's just math. It's the growth of the network, the growth of the hash rate, the adoption levels, the number of wallets, all that stuff has been pretty consistent. We're tracking the same trend line as the internet adoption. And when you think about Bitcoin being the native money of the internet, it makes perfect sense that it would follow the same sort of adoption curve as the internet. So now all of this also goes to, again, that interconnectedness of what we do, the ABCDs. So Bitcoin and blockchain is the B. the AI stuff is going to continue to integrate here, right? We're going to get smarter chains and smarter transaction networks and agentic tools. I'm far less concerned about this AGI thing, Terminator, like, destroying everything. I just don't think that's really that likely. I think what is super likely is certain aspects of intellect are going to get routinized the same way a calculator makes calculation easier, or a computer makes communication easier, or your mobile phone makes, having information at your fingertips easier. So agentic AI coupled with blockchain organization of data, one of the interesting things is data. We don't talk as much about data.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, data is everything. It's the base layer of everything. I did love this. So, my son worked at Snowflake, and they were famous for establishing data lakes. That was their thing, is, you put all your data out there and it's in this big lake and you can go fishing anytime you want. We'll only charge you when you got your pole in the water, and you don't have to take care of it. It's actually a good idea. So then Databricks came along and said, all right, well, we got this thing, and I don't know if they coined it or Snowflake, but now you got, data warehouses. I think that was Databricks. Bricks were more, we're going to build warehouses, and Snowflake had the data lakes. Well, now the new thing is data lake houses.
Oh, I got to have a lake house. Can I have a data beach house? And do I need...
Exactly. And but what I think people are realizing is, well, it's not all your data that's so important. It's the critical data at the critical time. Well, how do you get that data? Well, how do you organize that data? Oh my gosh, how do you process that data? Now here comes the chip part, and then how do we process it in an energy efficient manner? Well, there's the innovation part. And so I still marvel, because now I saw another chart crime. Number of jobs can be eliminated by humanoid robots. And it started at basically zero, and it went like to every job in the world, within 15 years. Like, well, that isn't going to happen. It's just not. But some jobs will get automated. But the innovation that will occur along the way will create more jobs, as it always has, right? How many people work at Snowflake today that didn't have a job before Snowflake existed? A lot. How many people work at Amazon? A lot. And so same thing's going to happen. And there's no question that a lot of the jobs are going to change. Like if you asked a 15-year-old in the 40s what they want to be when they grow up, they would have said a fireman or a policeman, right? If you asked them in the 70s and 80s, what do you want to be? They said, I want to be a professional football player, basketball player. If you asked them in the 90s, they said, I want to be a rock star, a MTV star. If you ask them today, I want to be a YouTube influencer. YouTube influencer didn't exist, but what's interesting is the change from service business, policeman, fireman, to entertainer, right? Athlete, musician, to now entertainer in terms of producing content. But as you go from an industrial society to a consumer society, you do spend more time consuming content. And there's this circular aspect to it, is we all worry in our world, and we wear orange because of it, and love Bitcoin because of it, because governments can print money out of thin air and devalue the currency. And what does that do? Well, if there's more currency, it actually can't circulate as quickly, right? Because you just got to carry it around in a wheelbarrow. But what really makes economies tick is that circulation of the currency. And so, yes, you can say, well, we don't make anything in the United States. I'm like, okay, but think about it. I can take $1 and go get my haircut. I can pay my hair cutter. Then he can go to a restaurant and get a meal and pay that dollar. And then the restaurateur can go to the butcher and buy some goods from the butcher. Then the butcher can go to the store and buy a shirt. And then the shirt seller can, come invest it with us. And so it's a complete circle. That same dollar generated a lot of activity, but we didn't make anything. Okay, but we all have a good life. The haircutter's cutting hair and the shirt seller's selling shirts. And, we can add all kinds of other things, like I'm consuming video game content or I buy a new guitar, all of these things. But where'd that guitar come from? Well, someone had to make it. Well, what if China won't make our stuff anymore? Because they want to be consumers. Then we'll make it in Vietnam or Bhutan or wherever else the next place, or humanoids. I mean, so I guess I don't know what we're all afraid of, but there's a lot of fear.
So that is a perfect segue and the perfect reminder that I always give to our audience. Check us out on YouTube, rate, review, and subscribe so you can see awesome things like the chart of the week. We're going to have a two for Mark. One, I love James Bond, as you may know, and one of my favorite ones is, I think it was maybe the second one that Pierce Brosnan did. So I was in the Pierce era, a little bit of a T-Dult, but he didn't have that many movies. But really Pierce, and so the one where he was with Terry Hatcher, The World Is Not Enough.
Yes.
That's kind of a scary one because you can kind of see that actually happening. And then the famous quote from that one is, "Nothing sells news like bad news." And so that is a perfect preamble to the Misery Index, where we kind of show just how, how things are trending here, and kind of what gives people a little bit of a cause to pause. So I will share this screen, Mark. Let me know if it comes up on your end.
Yep.
So we can dive in a little bit. And this might be a little bit of a pretext to what actually ARC published about their price target. So they had a whole survey about this, which was actually in great detail about their assumptions. But we can maybe think about how that might contrast here. So what we're seeing here, Mark, is 70 years of misery. And so what is that trying to show us? It's combining inflation and unemployment, and kind of like how that might impact things like families. But it's interspersed here, Mark, with some periods of recession. So sometimes you can be miserable. There's some people who are just, no matter what you tell them, Mark, they're going to find a way to be miserable. Like, oh, it's a nice day today. It might rain tomorrow, right? And so
exactly. Yep.
Does not always mean that. So, Mark, when you see something like this, what are some thoughts that come to mind, especially macro guy like you?
Well, I mean, the first is that from again, all the fear and loathing, searches for stagflation are off the charts. There this doesn't show any, right? This shows relatively low inflation and a declining trend in inflation. And again, well, all the jobs are being lost. Well, no, they're not. In fact, we had a number this morning, Friday morning, that there were more jobs created last month than we thought. And so the misery index is declining. Yet when you ask CEOs, super miserable. I mean, business confidence is hitting off. Consumer sentiment just hit, I think, the second lowest level in history. And so this actually says to me that, things really aren't as bad. And people are worried that the tariffs create inflation. They actually don't. I mean, they create goods inflation in the sense that the iPhone that you want to buy won't be $1,000. It'll be $2,000 if it has to be made in the United States. And that car will go up a lot if it's imported from someplace else. But that actually leads to lower consumption, which actually spirals down into deflation. And when you reduce global trade, that's deflationary, not inflationary. So this is telling me that if you define misery as only inflation, like your money's being stolen from you faster, monetary inflation, and I don't have a job, then things aren't very miserable. If you turn it on its head a little bit and say, well, this was a great index 50 years ago because we had a lot of still industrial workers and factory workers, and we shipped all those to China along with the pollution and those problems. But like most government statistics, in my opinion, it's a little outdated. It doesn't reflect the information age very well. The other thing that isn't included here that I don't know how to fix because I haven't really thought deeply about it, but the participation rate is not reflected here properly. Like every time someone turns 65, as I understand it, they take them out of the workforce. Well, people don't stop working at 65 anymore. I mean, people are super healthy well into their 70s and 80s, and many of them, I mean, I went to dinner the other night. We celebrated, in our family, we have lots of April birthdays, so we just have one go out to dinner day where we celebrate all the birthdays. And we went to this famous restaurant down here called Angus Barn, and the greeter has been there as long as he's been the same guy greeting people since I've lived here, which is now 28 years. And he's got to be, I mean, he's 80 if he's a day, but he's showing up every day to the Angus Barn, doing his job, being nice to people. And, you know, that's different than it used to be. So
I'll mention the twofer, and you mentioned the greeter. It is with a heavy heart that we lose Miss Lisa, the greeter at my son's daycare, to retirement. But to your point, she is just getting started as far as what she wants to do. She's an avid skier, Girl Scout troop leader. So if you're listening, Miss Lisa, thank you for everything you've done. We'll switch over here to the second piece where we go in a little bit more onto what ARC is projecting. Because Mark, there's some insights here that I think you might have some opinions on. So if we kind of accept this idea that, okay, we could be in for some pretty big numbers in 5 years about what Bitcoin is supposed to look like, what does it actually mean when you break it down from a potential use case by target consumption, which I think is much more interesting because people say there is no purpose for Bitcoin, so therefore it has no value, so therefore 100K doesn't make any sense, it's speculative. But if you unpack that a little bit, that's what this chart, I think, aims to do with the, you know, potential use cases. So, Mark, it's splitting up for the audio listeners, 3 different cases: the bear, the base, and the bull. Obviously, the bull is the high 2.4 million target. The bear is, I think, 300 or 500, and then the base is somewhere in between. I love how, Mark, a base case of Bitcoin in 5 years is $1 million, but yeah, we digress.
No, we digress. But look, I agree with you that this is exactly the right way to think about it. Is different people and organizations, institutions do things for different reasons, and even individual investors, some buy for speculation, some buy for safety, some buy for growth, some buy for value. But Bitcoin clearly, at least in my view, is digital gold, right? It has all the aspects of gold, and it's better. It's more divisible and more portable, more permanent, more verifiable. Lots of pictures on the internet of, gold bars that are really lead painted with gold. It's just easy to verify Bitcoin because it's on the ledger. So the component, the gold on the chart, the component that is digital gold, I don't know that actually is gonna get squeezed. It shows this big amount of institutional ownership. I actually don't think that's going to happen. What I mean by that is there's 2 ways that the value can change. One is more people buy it. So more institutions come in and buy it, and therefore there's a supply-demand imbalance and the bid-ask goes up. Well, then there's it gets bought and put in a box, cold storage. It is true digital gold or savings, particularly by nation states putting it on their balance sheet, and they separate that out, nation state treasury versus digital gold. I'm not sure those are.
I was surprised by that as well, Mark, because, I would have thought digital gold, nation states, they would kind of, cross-pollinate here. But I wonder if by digital gold, they're talking about hodlers here. And obviously what we're not seeing a whole lot here is that, the pie is growing. So, 35% at the bull case of 2.5 million, is greater than, 48% of a 1 million, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think part of the challenge of this exercise is it's not like most other things.
Yeah.
Like the Doritos commercial, go ahead and eat them, we'll make more. You don't get to make more here. In fact, there's a slowly declining supply because of lost or stolen or whatever. And you're not going to make more. So, but my point is you can have two ways for the value to increase. One is that there's this supply demand push, but the other is the price could just go up, meaning the value of the currency could continue to devalue. And so you could have a situation where the hodlers hodl and the nation states and the institutions are fighting to buy, but they don't get to buy as much, right? That gold segment stays very large, and what's left to buy, the price has to go up by a lot. And that actually, I think, is what happens here. Is there's so much that's going to be truly savings, multi-generational. You actually never sell it. You just borrow against it and use it, or you lend it, and it becomes the base layer of the global financial system. And the individual unit, which I don't think by this time we'll talk about Bitcoin anymore. I think we'll talk about Satoshis, right? Mm-hmm. 2.4 quadrillion Satoshis. And that means instead of $1 million per Bitcoin, we divide that million by 100,000. I'm sorry, by 100 million.
100 million,
down 100 million. And we get down to a much more manageable unit of account, and everybody can have lots of Satoshis. I mean, the problem with Bitcoin is, you all seen the thing, 8 billion divided by 21 million. I mean, that's just, there's too many people to own one Bitcoin. Yet there are plenty of people who own a Bitcoin who are never going to sell it. I was one story that I wanted. So I read, and maybe this is probably, it could be urban legend. It might be true, but there was a guy talking about, he was a maxi, and he's saying he met this cleaning woman at this hotel he stayed at, and she talked about how she had been, socking away a little bit into Bitcoin, dollar cost averaging, because she had met someone, that stayed at the hotel, right? Some number of years ago, and that she had made it to a full Bitcoin, right? Which for a working class person, right, $100,000 or just under, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of savings.
Absolutely.
And the cool thing is, she didn't put $100,000 in, right? Because Bitcoin's up a lot, right? She started buying it when it was 10,000, and then 20,000, then 60,000, then 40,000, then 20,000, then 15,000. So she's bought it through the ups and downs. So let's say she put in 30K. Still a lot of money to save, as is for anyone. And that's really cool. And look, you could do the same story if someone had dollar cost average into NVIDIA, or if dollar cost average into Apple, the fruit stock like Forrest. So, but the point there is that Bitcoin, I don't think that's trading. I don't think, no matter what Larry Fink wants to pay for that, she's not selling it. It's going to be her savings. And maybe over time, she skims off a few Satoshis here and there and uses it. But I really think there is this element of permanent savings that's real. And that means that in order for the network value to accrete, the price per unit has to go up.
Yeah, that's a great point that we'll probably wrap on, Mark, because I think if you're kind of looking at that difference between investing in digital gold versus fruit companies, people tend to leave a market once they hit a mark because they believe that that value can be transferred someplace else. When you have, in theory, an ascending asset, well, I'm going to leave when I need to create a goal. Let's say if I need to buy a house or I need to pay for college. But then once I've satisfied that goal, I'm going to go right back into that ascending asset and continue my growth. Whereas I may not go back to a fruit company. Maybe I like, a Doritos company, for example.
Well, and to that point, there are plenty of examples. And my brother-in-law works at UBS, and he has plenty of clients who grew up accumulating shares of ExxonMobil and Apple and IBM.
Yeah.
And they never sold those shares. Their cost basis is literally pennies on the dollar. They just borrowed from UBS at a nice interest rate and paid their bills, and then they would sell a little bit of stock over time to pay back the loan, or they'd use their Social Security money or whatever it was. And then their portfolio just kept growing. And the same thing is true with any asset. You don't have to sell it. You can borrow against it in a fully functioning financial system. And then you can sell some over time. But if the growth rate is higher than your sales rate, it's like an endowment, right? If you're earning more than 5%, but you're spending 5%, the value of that endowment is going to keep going up, which everybody gets all upset. Oh, these endowments are, these universities are too rich. You need to tax them. Like, no, they're providing a service to the students and the faculty. Now, you may disagree with some of that service. That's fine. So maybe, you want to set rules for proper use and adoption. But this idea that someone's a good investor and therefore you should take a piece of it away is just silly. It's always been silly. Ms. Warren's like, oh, I want to tax unrealized gains. What? You should never tax gains at all. You should never tax innovation and wealth creation. You should encourage both of those things, because without them, none of what we talk about matters. And with them, supporting them, you get better for everybody.
Yep.
But I digress.
No, great chat, Mark, and we'll wrap it on that point. And remind our listeners, always rate, review, subscribe. Check us out on YouTube. We've been enjoying the community there as it's been interactive. And remind our listeners, as always, to stay current. Thank you for joining us this week on Digital Currents. Check out our links to our website and social media in the show's description box. Please make sure to subscribe if you like what you hear. And remember, stay current.
This podcast should not be construed as investment advice nor solicitation for the sale of any security, advisory, or other service. Investment themes and ideas discussed may be owned by funds managed by the host and podcast guests. Any conflicts at the time of production have been mentioned by the host but are subject to change. Listeners should consult their personal financial advisors before making any investment decisions.